activity so that in the long run, American workers and families enjoy more prosperity and opportunity. The evidence shows that this is already beginning to happen. As Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell put it recently, the economy is doing very well. The Bureau of Economic Analysis recently revised upward its estimate of GDP growth to 4.2% in the last quarter, and survey after survey shows that business optimism is surging. Individual tax relief has allowed people to keep more of their hard-earned money so that it's worth it to work hard, to find a job, and to keep reaching for that next opportunity. By investing in individuals and those who employ them, we're putting a down payment on a more prosperous future for all Americans. After business reforms became law, companies started to invest in their workers and businesses in ways that lead to a more productive workforce. That, in turn, leads to growing paychecks and higher economic growth in the long run. This reform fought for American workers by attracting investment here at home and encouraging companies to keep high-valued intellectual property in America instead of overseas. It's been a game changer. Profits earned in international markets are returning to the United States, where it can be invested in greater opportunities for our people. Though we shouldn't base the success of tax reform on what's happening in the short term, we're already seeing positive effects from these long-term incentives to work and invest. Business investment, which paves the way for future wage and economic growth, is picking up. After all, an employee's wages can only increase following the decision by a business to invest more in its workers and company. We want that to be an easy decision. Since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act became law, business investment has outperformed similar periods in 2017 and far exceeded the weak and sometimes negative growth in the final year of the Obama administration. This chart that we see here comparing second quarter growth rates shows how much business investment has increased in the last 2 years compared to the last year of the Obama administration. In fact, since tax reform became law, we've seen an average growth rate of 10% so far this year. That's great news. Yes, it will take time for tax reform to have its full effect on investment and wages, yet the Congressional Budget Office noticed rising wages in its latest report on federal revenues. JEC economists here at the Joint Economic Committee also analyzed 21 different measures of wage growth and inflation, and 20 of the 21 showed real wages rising faster during this Congress and administration than during the Obama-era recovery. Small business owners are also seeing benefits, with small business optimism, new hiring, worker pay increases, and investment plans near record highs. And for those who claim that tax reform only benefits the wealthy, there's great news for those Americans who struggle the most in a very weak economy, those with less education, minority workers, and people with disabilities. Unemployment is at its lowest level since the year 2000, but the untold story that it is still falling faster for those that are disadvantaged groups than for the groups that tend to do very well. It's also worth noting that the Joint Committee on Taxation found that during the time individual tax relief from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is in effect, the greatest percentage of tax cuts will go to those with incomes between $20,000 and $50,000, and that millionaires will actually pay a larger share of the federal tax burden with tax reform than they would without it. Tax reform was just a first step. We should continue to improve our tax code to meet the challenges of an ever-changing global economy. But the Tax Cut and Jobs Act put America on a much stronger economic footing, which will make many of our nation's challenges easier to tackle. I look forward today to a very distinguished panel of witnesses, including one from my home state of Minnesota. And before I do introduce our panel of experts, I would now like to recognize the Ranking Member, Senator Heinrich, for a period of 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Paulsen. I agree with you that it's useful to look at the Republican tax law's impacts on our economy, on working families, and our nation's economic position. I suspect we may come to some different conclusions. At best, the Republican tax bill was a massive missed opportunity, squandering $1.9 trillion on tax breaks for those who didn't need them at a time when our nation could least afford it. The bill does little to help working families. Instead, it worsens inequality and burdens the next generation with trillions in additional debt, which could jeopardize vital programs and services that families count on. At a basic level, the law simply hasn't lived up to Republican promises. The White House and our Republican colleagues promised families a $4,000 a year increase in income. That simply hasn't happened. In fact, hourly wages adjusted which you can see in this chart here, adjusted for inflation, are actually going down, not up. And as you can see in the chart on wage growth, the average hourly wage for production and non-supervisory workers, our best measure of the typical worker's take-home pay, was lower in July of 2018 than in July of 2017 after adjusting for inflation. In other words, wages simply aren't keeping pace with the cost of living. That means it's harder for a typical family to buy groceries, to pay rent, to put gas in the tank. After decades of wage stagnation, where the median workers' wages have grown by 6.1% over the last 38 years, people need a real raise, not empty promises. The reality is that Republican tax bill is doing exactly what virtually all mainstream economists and Democrats said it would do. It is delivering the vast majority of its benefits to large corporations and wealthy individuals, while leaving working Americans behind. Stock buybacks are now at record highs, with Goldman Sachs projecting that they will reach $1 trillion by the end of the year. While buybacks benefit company executives and other wealthy shareholders and investors, they do nothing for half of all Americans who own no stock. And since foreign investors own 35% of U.S. stocks, much of the benefits of these buybacks are actually flowing overseas. It's important to remember that each dollar spent on buybacks is a dollar not spent on investing in factories or plants, in training or boosting workers' wages. We could have gone a different direction. My Republican colleagues could have joined with Democrats to craft deficit-neutral, pro-growth tax reform. But by adding $1.9 trillion to the national debt, the tax law gives Republicans their latest justification to target Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Just last month, Republican Representative Steve Stivers, the chair of the NRCC, expressed support for turning Medicare into a voucher program. Republicans are again pushing to cut health care coverage that families receive through Medicaid and go after Medicare and Social Security, which seniors and their families count on. In my state, more than half of New Mexicans depend on these three programs and the Affordable Care Act to help with health care and living expenses. Cuts to these programs would have devastating consequences for families who have seen little to no benefit from the tax cuts. Recent economic projections remind us that any growth bump from a Republican tax cut will be short-lived. So Republicans will try to take our eyes elsewhere. Republicans will point to the second quarter GDP growth, but will neglect to mention that we have hit higher levels multiple times in this recovery, or that long-term projections remain unchanged. In fact, economists at the San Francisco Fed recently projected that the tax cuts could have zero impact to growth due to the poor timing of the law. They'll talk about this year's job growth, but fail to acknowledge that 2018 and 2017 look basically the same as 2016 and 2015. In fact, as this chart on job growth shows, the economy is adding fewer jobs per month since President Trump took over. Now, Republicans want to make permanent the temporary provisions of the bill to dole out a second helping of tax breaks, but doing so would deliver 2/3 of the benefits to the wealthiest 20% and add nearly $800 billion more to the debt by 2028. The Republican tax law was the wrong medicine at the wrong time. The solution is not to take more of it. I want to thank each of our witnesses here today for your testimony, and I look forward to a very spirited discussion.
Thank you, Senator Heinrich, and I'll now introduce our witnesses. Mr. Scott Hidge is the president of the Tax Foundation, and during his tenure, the Tax Foundation has become one of the most influential organizations on tax policy in Washington and in state capitals. He led the development of the Tax Foundation's most successful programs, including the Taxes and Growth Dynamic Tax Modeling Project. Mr. Hidge has published extensive research on tax policy and government spending, and has edited 3 books on the federal budget and streamlining government. Before joining the Tax Foundation, Mr. Hidge was the Director of Tax and Budget Policy at Citizens for a Sound Economy. In the 1990s, he helped design proposals that influenced major tax legislation in 1997, 2001, and 2003. He also analyzed policy at the Heritage Foundation and founded the Heartland Institute. Mr. Hidge holds a BA in Political Science from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Also with us is Dr. William Dunkelberg, who is the Chief Economist of the National Federation of Independent Business, or NFIB, which is the largest small business association in the United States and well known for its advocacy on behalf of small and independent business owners. Dr. Dunkelberg is also a professor emeritus of economics at the School of Business and Management at Temple University, where he formerly served as both the dean and director of the Center for the Advancement and Study of Entrepreneurship. He is a contributor on economic forecasting panels for major news outlets and authored numerous books and articles. Previously, he served as an advisor to the Secretary of Commerce and was appointed to the Consumer Advisory Council of the Federal Reserve System. He also co-founded Wireless Energy Solutions, was an economic strategist in the private sector, and served as chairman of Liberty Bell Bank. Dr. Dunkelberg received his BA, MA, and PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. And then I want to welcome our witness from Minnesota. Mr. John Hinderaker is the president of the Center of the American Experiment. It's a public policy organization known as Minnesota's think tank. The center researches and produces papers on topics ranging from Minnesota's economy, state and local governance, to crafting and proposing creative solutions that emphasize free enterprise, limited government, personal responsibility, and government accountability. Before becoming president of the Center of the American Experiment, Mr. Hinderaker spent 41 years as a litigator with Faegre & Benson and its successor, Faegre Baker Daniels, and received numerous awards and recognitions for his work. Mr. Hinderaker has appeared as a commentator on major television networks and is a frequent guest and guest host on national radio programs. In addition, Mr. Hinderaker has lectured at colleges and universities ranging from Harvard Law School to my alma mater, St. Olaf, where we both have daughters attending. Mr. Hinderaker holds an AB from Dartmouth College and a JD from Harvard Law School. Thanks for making the trip to be with us. And our final witness who is with us tonight is Dr. Benjamin Harris, who is a visiting associate professor at Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University with a focus in tax, budget, and retirement policy. Dr. Harris also serves as the chief economist at Results for America. Previously, Dr. Harris served as the chief economist and economic advisor for former Vice President Biden. He later was senior economic policy advisor at Rocos Capital Management and served in roles at the Hamilton Project, Brookings Institution, the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, the Council of Economic Advisors, and the House Budget Committee. He holds a PhD in economics from George Washington University and other degrees from Tufts, Cornell, and Columbia University. Welcome, all of you. You will each have 5 minutes for your presentation, and with that, we will begin with Mr. Hidge and follow in order. Mr. Hidge, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Heinrich, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about the economic benefits that we expect to see from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. You know, few organizations have modeled these effects as much as we have at the Tax Foundation over the last few years. The Act contains a number of very pro-growth elements, such as cutting the corporate tax rate, moving to full expensing for capital investments, that will not only result in higher levels of GDP, higher wages, and more jobs, they will make the United States more competitive globally. And these provisions will improve incentives to work and invest, which is why when we used our taxes and growth macroeconomic model to score the plan, we found out our model shows that it will have a positive long-term effect on the economy. And I do want to underscore long-term. And while we've seen a lot of great economic data recently, and it's been very encouraging, it's unrealistic to expect major tax policy changes like this to produce immediate results. And I know politics can be very impatient and the media wants headlines, but tax reform and economic growth do not fit within a 24-hour news cycle. In fact, this kind of reminds me, this whole debate reminds me of a long car ride with your children. About an hour into the car ride, they're kicking the back of your seat saying, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" But like a long car ride, economic changes and major changes like this take time and patience, and we have to tune out the chatter from the back seat. And over the next decade and beyond, our model predicts what we might call an arc of economic growth, rising and falling with the temporary or permanent nature of the various tax provisions in the bill. In the first few years, the economic impact will be modest as companies begin to invest more in plant and equipment and build the nation's capital stock. But by 2025, the economy will be, we estimate, 3% larger than it otherwise would be. However, in 2026, when the individual provisions expire and the 100% bonus expensing phases out, the economy will begin to shrink a little bit and move back to normal baseline. But on average, over the next decade, the level of GDP will be about 2% larger than baseline. Now, it doesn't sound like much, but that translates into a cumulative $5.3 trillion worth of additional GDP over the next decade. Now, if we look at the very long term, as our model does, we estimate that the new tax law will boost the level of GDP by 1.7%, boost wages by 1.5%, and create 340,000 additional full-time jobs. Now, nearly all of those long-term effects are the result of the permanent cut in the corporate tax rate. However, our model predicts that if the Congress were to make the expensing provision permanent and the individual rates permanent, you could multiply those results considerably. In fact, dollar for dollar, the most pro-growth tax measure that Congress can enact is making that permanent, the expensing provision permanent. And all of those economic benefits translate into higher after-tax incomes for all Americans. The tax cuts themselves, of course, are great for taxpayers. But by 2025, we expect that the additional economic growth and wage growth will lead to a rise in after-tax incomes of 4.6% on average for all taxpayers. And the model actually indicates that even should we face a fiscal cliff and the individual provisions expire, after-tax incomes for all taxpayers will still be higher because of the economic growth and wage growth than they would have otherwise been had there been no tax cut. Now, nonetheless, Congress should make those individual provisions permanent to avoid an unfair tax increase. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll conclude with just a simple reminder. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is barely 9 months old. You know, most kids are not even crawling by that age, so it's really too soon to say, are we there yet? And let's not forget that 1 year ago, the U.S. had the highest corporate tax rate in the industrialized world. We had one of the worst cost recovery systems anywhere for capital investments. And we had one of the most progressive personal income tax systems anywhere in the world. Today, we have one of the most competitive corporate tax systems in the world. And these changes will lift wages, will create jobs, and will grow the economy if we give it time. But the prosperity won't last unless we make all of these tax changes permanent, and the sooner, the better. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Hidge. Dr. Dunkelberg, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Paulsen and Ranking Member Heinrich, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk to you about the JCTA from the point of view of small businesses. The small business sector, of course, is very important to the economy, estimated to be about 48% of private GDP. That's a lot of output, and roughly half of the private sector labor force. So if you want to worry about productivity, then you really need to worry about investment in the small business sector, because there are a lot of workers there, and they get included when we calculate our average productivity growth numbers. They're very, very important. Now, over the last 45 years, NFIB, National Federation of Independent Business, has taken a random sample of its hundreds of thousands of member firms and sent out a questionnaire asking a bunch of information about how the company's doing and what people expect. And in that questionnaire, which, by the way, stays pretty much the same, we don't change the question so we don't lose the meaning of the index, 10 of those questions go into this index that we call the Small Business Optimism Index. And that's proved to be very informative over the past 45 years. It reached its record high level in July of 1983 of 108, and very recently almost hit that again at 107.9 last month. The average of the index over the 45 years is about 98, but just to give you perspective on how important it can be and the changes in the what the changes tell us, in October of 2016, the average index was 95, and that's 3 points below the average. In the first week of November, the index was still 95. How do we know that? Remember, we mail out 10,000 interviews, they come back, and we can kind of do a before and after analysis. So it was 95 before the election results were announced. Once announced, the index rose to 102, in the remaining months of November and hit 105.8 in December, and it hasn't looked back since then. We've been averaging well over 105 for all those months since. Now, small business owners had no idea really what the policy details were going to look like. All they knew was there was going to be a change, there was a new management team, and they thought whatever they were going to get, I guess, was going to be better than what they had, and that made them very optimistic about the future and what they can attain in the future. So if you look at how the index is done, it has really gone from 105 to 100 and almost 108, almost to the record high. Since we changed the management team and we got a new set of economic policies. Now, originally the index was dominated by the expectations component. So there are 10 components, as I pointed out, and 5 of them are kind of, do you expect business conditions to be better in 6 months? You plan, is now a good time to expand your business? And what about expected real sales? Those kinds of expectations questions. That dominated the index and drove it up over 105. Since then, the mix of this has changed. It's become a very muscular index, dominated by record high job openings, record high plans to hire, record high capital spending plans, record high reports of higher income, and record high plans to increase inventory investments. So that's the meat of gross domestic product, and of course we're really happy to see that. And that means also, of course, we've had really great experience with employment gains over that period of time. So just as an example, capital spending plans in November of 2016, 55%, or not plans, but actual outlays, now 66% earlier this year. So an 11-point increase in the percent of our owners investing in capital equipment and expanding their business. So that has worked out very well. The most important, we ask a question every time, what's the most important problem facing your business today? They have 10 options. Outside of Volcker and inflation back in the in the olden days, what's dominated is taxes and the cost of regulatory compliance, another tax on small businesses. So that's been averaging around 21% in the olden days, now fallen as low as 13% since the TCJA had been passed. So it had good features that you mentioned, the expensing and the lower rates. Also, 199A was very good because it finally looked at the pass-through organizations, and we're happy to have that happen as well. But what we see is that they have really responded to the change in policy, and they're putting their money where their mouth is. You look at what they plan to do with the money that they hope will get by the tax change, and they're going to invest and hire, and that's the key. And of course, productivity will increase as long as we continue to invest in our workers in the small business sector. So we'd like to see permanency as well, so we can depend on it. Uncertainty is the enemy of growth, so we don't want uncertainty. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and we'll answer questions later.
Thank you, Dr. Dunkelberg. Mr. Hinderaker, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Paulsen, Ranking Member Heinrich, members of the Joint Economic Committee, thank you for your invitation to provide testimony for this important hearing. My name is John Hinderaker, and I am president of Center of the American Experiment. The subject of my testimony is the impact of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act on the economy of Minnesota, where my organization is headquartered. While only 8 months have elapsed since the act became effective, already its positive effects are becoming obvious. We have identified at least 34 Minnesota companies based on news reports that have announced new hiring, wage increases, and so on as a direct result of the act. No doubt the companies on which there are news stories represent only a small fraction of those who have made such investments in Minnesota in consequence of the act. Because of the act's recent passage and the fact that publication of state-level data often lags behind national data, we are not yet able to measure the law's impact on Minnesota by some metrics, for example, GDP. But there is every reason to believe that Minnesota's GDP has risen strongly along with that of the nation as a whole. On the other hand, the Bureau of Labor Statistics updates state-level jobs and income data monthly, and here we can clearly see the positive effects of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Figure one shows the monthly net change in private jobs in Minnesota. The positive impact of the act starting in January 2018 pretty much jumps off the chart. The 2018 hiring peak is nearly 20,000 jobs above the 2017 hiring peak. This effect on jobs is even more clear in Figure 2, also from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but seasonally adjusted and from a different data set. Here again, you can see the strong employment growth that began with the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It's the biggest jobs gain in at least a decade. Wages in Minnesota are rising as well. You can see that in Figure 3, which shows average weekly earnings in Minnesota. Again, the upswing that began with the passage of the act is unmistakable. Average weekly earnings in Minnesota have risen by 2.7% since January 2018, more than double the 1.2% increase in the same period of 2017. Figure 4 shows seasonally adjusted hourly earnings of all private employees in Minnesota. You can see that wage growth had stagnated during the second half of 2017, but took off with the passage of the act. The Tax Foundation estimates that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will add 6,789 full-time equivalent jobs to Minnesota's economy and yield a gain in after-tax income of $722.40 for each of the state's middle-income families. The data indicate that these projections are well on the way to being realized. It is worth noting also that Minnesota's Office of Management and Budget expects the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to boost Minnesota's GDP growth. In February 2017, the office's forecaster, IHS Markit, predicted good GDP growth driven by the act. But in November 2017, it didn't look as though the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was going to pass. So the Office of Management and Budget lowered Minnesota's fiscal forecast, predicting a deficit of $188 million for the current biennium. Then, when the act did pass in December, the forecast was revised again, with the effect of the tax cuts reinstated. OMB now predicted, instead of a deficit, a surplus of $329 million. So Minnesota's Office of Management and Budget is aligned with other forecasters who see the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act producing stronger economic growth in Minnesota. So the evidence is clear that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is already helping Minnesota's families. With that, I thank you again for the opportunity to testify and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And Dr. Harris, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to begin this testimony by thanking Chairman Paulsen, Ranking Member Heinrich, and all members of the committee for inviting me to testify at this important hearing. It is truly an honor to receive this invitation. I'll start by noting that independent organizations have generally reached a consensus around the impact of the TCJA. A collection of independent entities have found that the initial boost provided by the bill will eventually wear off, slowing the growth rate in later years as rising interest rates due to growing deficits and the expiration of the tax cuts drag down the economy. Projections also find that the legislation drives up both public debt and borrowing from abroad, giving foreign investors a larger claim on domestic income, leaving income earned by Americans little changed. For example, CBO projects that the bill will grow real GNP by just 0.1% by 2028. These projections aside, I'd like to raise three main concerns with the legislation. My first concern is that the bill is poorly designed to spur new investment in a cost-effective way. One of the most significant shortcomings of the bill is the large windfall gain provided to investors. In this context, windfall gains refer to tax cuts awarded to individuals and businesses for something they have already done. The corporate tax cut and the deemed repatriation on foreign earnings are classic examples of windfall gains. Since a tax cut's impact on growth is largely determined by whether it raises investment or labor supply, windfall gains represent a wasted opportunity to boost the economy and are one of the primary reasons why so many project the act to have a tepid impact on long-run growth. A related concern with the bill is that it will actually reduce certain types of investment. According to CBO, the bill will lower combined investment in residential real estate and intellectual property by over $200 billion combined. My second concern is that the bill's steep increase in debt will hurt middle-class families. As members of this committee are well aware, our nation faces serious long-term fiscal challenges, with dire projections of a public debt explosion even before the bill became law. But the bill has greatly exacerbated concerns over soaring debt, raising deficits by roughly $2 trillion over the next decade. And these costs will rise substantially if the legislation is made permanent. There are plenty of concerns with exploding debt, but one particular worry is if policymakers respond by cutting major public programs such as Social Security and Medicare. Social Security is the bedrock of the U.S. retirement system, with roughly half of elderly households relying on its benefits for all or nearly all of their retirement income, while another quarter of elderly households depend on Social Security for a substantial portion. Cutting it would be a major blow to older Americans. Widespread cuts to Medicare and Medicaid would also be exceptionally harmful to American retirees, especially those with limited income or assets who cannot plausibly return to the labor market. An additional concern is the impact of higher interest rates on middle-class families. The higher debt levels in the bill will raise interest rates, making everything from home ownership to student loans to credit card payments more expensive for American households, even before they are asked to begin repaying the massive debt incurred under this tax law. My third concern is that the bill is poorly designed to benefit workers. In broad terms, there are two primary ways the tax cut can increase wages. One is by increasing worker productivity through higher business investment. Under this scenario, tax reform can eventually raise wages by first increasing the level of investment, which can then boost worker productivity, which can then, in theory, boost wages. There are plenty of caveats to this situation, but the key point is that without higher investment, there is no plausible argument for a tax cut raising wages. Legislation can also increase after-tax wages by directly cutting taxes on labor. This can effectively be done through a payroll tax cut, a refundable credit based on earnings, or an EITC expansion, but cuts in income tax rates are generally ineffective ways to boost middle-class wages because so many families pay little to no income taxes. Unfortunately, in my opinion, the bill receives poor marks on these various criteria. Future academic studies will shed light on the bill's investment impact, but initial evidence suggests that it has primarily boosted share repurchases rather than investment. Distributional analysis shows the tax cuts are of limited value to working families, and these families will begin paying more in 2026 with higher tax bills indefinitely thereafter. Lastly, the bill's relatively favorable treatment of businesses compared to workers may exacerbate the enduring fall of labor's share of national income, meaning an even smaller piece of the pie for workers across the country. In sum, the combination of limited new investment, substantially higher debt, and potential cuts to critical programs to offset that debt, and little positive impact on wages means that the bill is unlikely to achieve its purported economic effects. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. And with that, during our question and answer period, just remind members to keep their questions to 5 minutes. And I'll just begin. Mr. Hidge, you had outlined how our corporate rate now has made us much more competitive, and the long-term effect is very positive, obviously, for our economy. So two questions. One, debt and deficits obviously very important, and are they a problem of just having not enough revenue, or is it a problem also of growing mandatory spending? And is our long-term debt problem easier to tackle in a growing economy or in a weak economy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In fact, actually the CBO addressed some of that recently in a report. They were looking at projecting out both revenues and spending over the next decade. And they found that they estimate that revenues will be about 17.2% of GDP over the next decade, which is about at the national average over the last 50 years. Meanwhile, spending will be about 22% of GDP over the next decade, which is a couple of percentage points higher than where they've been over the last 50 years. So really spending is the problem. Entitlement spending is out of control. And it seems as though, according to CBO, revenues will pretty well stabilize at around 17% of GDP. What's important, though, if you're looking at deficit reduction, is enacting policies that don't do harm to the economy while you're trying to reduce the deficit. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because there was a new report recently out of the IMF. They looked across the globe at all of the different countries that have cut their deficits at one time or another through tax or spending policies, and which ones did the most harm and which ones did the most good. And they found that cutting spending was the most beneficial for both reducing the deficit and for economic growth, whereas raising taxes did the most harm for economic growth, which ended up being counterproductive for trying to reduce the deficit. And that's based on an IMF survey of countries across the globe over the last few decades. So really we need to address the spending problem and leave the economic growth to come from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Good. Dr. Dunkelberg, you had mentioned 45 years of survey with your membership, almost at a record high now, showing overwhelmingly positive news from the small business community since tax reform. Now, because small business owners need to make long-term and long-range plans for their companies, are there plans to hire and to give more pay raises and make more investments? Is that a signal that they expect long-term growth at their companies and their businesses?
I certainly would interpret it, let's see, no, there we are. I would certainly interpret it that way. You know, all the decisions that small business owners make are always about the future. It's all about the future and not about the past. So decisions they're making now to spend and to hire are commitments to the future, and not just 6 months or a year, but much longer than that, especially when you look at the fact that we have a record high number now saying it's a good time to expand their business. That's heavy-duty stuff, not just, you know, a small investment in a new piece of equipment. All of that is very important. So we think they're very optimistic about the future, not just the immediate future, but long-term. They see a different set of policies that are conducive to growth in the economy and that are encouraging them to do the kinds of things that will raise worker productivity. And of course, to go along with that, we have a record high percentage who are now already reporting that they're raising worker compensation. So as our workers become more productive, we do pay them more. That's the way that number has to work out.
Mr. Hinderaker, in our final minute 15 here, thank you first of all for providing so much information on the economic conditions in Minnesota. I'm sure that other states are seeing some similar results based on my conversations with colleagues from federal tax reform. Now, what do you expect would happen in Minnesota for our economy if our state followed suit and actually lowered some of the tax burdens on its residents or businesses and had a focus along that front?
Well, two things. In the short term, I think we would see a boost like we've been seeing from the federal legislation. I think in the long term, it would be even more important because those tax cuts would make Minnesota competitive. So not only is it a good thing in the way that the federal tax cuts are a good thing, but it's an especially good thing because you get the benefits of the tax cuts, but then you get the secondary benefit that we're no longer one of these blue states with the highest taxes, I think currently the 6th highest tax burden, and those cuts would make Minnesota more competitive. So they would have tremendous long-range benefit for the state.
Good. Senator Heinrich, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I think we're all alone up here.
I see that.
Mr. Hidge, I appreciated your analogy about the kids in the back seat asking, "Are we there yet?" But I'd like to point out that hourly workers have been asking, "Are we there yet?" for 38 years, while their wages have stagnated, despite the fact that we've seen immense increases in productivity over that time. One of the reasons I think there is some frustration or impatience, as you put it, with this tax law is that there was a fairly explicit promise made by the President and some members of Congress that this would result in $4,000 worth of additional wages. Talk to me about that prediction. How does the data match up to a $4,000 increase in wages as a prediction?
Well, there's a lot at work here in the wage data, so I think we have to be a little bit careful with it. First and foremost, if you read a recent op-ed by Robert Samuelson in the Washington Post, he talked about a study that I think that is very important and how over the last few decades the growth in healthcare costs has really put a damper on wage growth.
Are we seeing an increase in wages that you can even count in $1,000 in 4 digits?
We've done this analysis, and our results were different from what the Council of Economic Advisors came up with, but ours was long-term results as well. Their analysis was a long-term estimate, and I think we have to be patient and stop saying, "Are we there yet?"
How long should workers be patient, given what they've gone through in the last 4 decades?
This could take just a few years, and I think what we're going to see this as soon as the expensing provisions begin to kick in, and a lot of that new equipment comes online, which makes workers much more competitive. And I think Dr. Harris is right. You know, cutting the corporate tax rate does help old investment as well as new investment, but where you really get the bang for your buck is that expensing provision where companies are allowed to go out and expense that new equipment, which makes their workers more productive.
Dr. Harris,
and they
what are
earn
you
more.
seeing in the wage data in terms of the impact of this?
Just to take that $4,000 calculation by Kevin Hassett, who is chairman of the CEA, we have a $1.3 trillion corporate tax cut over 10 years. So that's about $130 billion per year. In order to grant each worker a $4,000 on average wage, that just multiplying up the number of workers in the economy, we're talking about $600 billion per year. So what Dr. Hassett suggested was that a $130 billion per year tax cut in the corporate side would lead to $600 billion on the wage side. It's just implausible. I haven't seen.
Still looking for the worker. I've been asking people at home, you know, who got that $4,000 wage increase, and I'm still looking.
Well, wages on average have not grown since the patches of the tax cut.
Let me ask another question, and we can just go down the line here, and I'll start with you, Dr. Harrison, and we'll just go the other direction. This bill was not free. $1.9 trillion by one estimate. There are a number of different estimates, but we all recognize it came with a price tag. Now, a number of people, including the Speaker of the House, are saying that to pay for our current fiscal situation, that we need to cut Social Security, we need to cut Medicare, we need to cut Medicaid. Would each of you support cutting benefits for those three programs? Dr. Harrison, and we'll just go the other way.
So in addition to being a scholar who studies taxes, I've spent much of my career studying retirement. Social Security, in my opinion, is undoubtedly the bedrock of the U.S. Retirement system. About half of retirees, as I mentioned in my earlier testimony, depend almost entirely on Social Security. If you cut Social Security by 10%, you're making those workers 10% worse off. If we cut Social Security, we're asking older workers or older retirees who cannot plausibly.
I hate to cut you off.
That's fine. No, I would not.
Since it's just us, can we go a little long on this question? I'll let them finish each before. Great.
I'll just be direct.
Yep.
No, I would not. I would worry that cutting Social Security, Medicare, and even Medicaid, which supports long-term care, would have disastrous consequences for retirees.
You, sir.
Well, first of all, I think the best thing to do about our deficit, and I'm glad to see that people are concerned about the deficit. There's been too little concern about it, especially from the Democrats, for a long time, so I'm glad to see it. I think the best thing to do about the deficit is to grow the economy at something like a 4% rate. That does an enormous amount to protect on the spending side.
Growing the economy is absolutely fantastic for the deficit.
However,
would you support cuts to those three programs?
I would not support cuts to Social Security. I would support cuts to Medicare, which is really the one that's breaking the bank. We've got to find a way to restrain the growth in that program.
Social Security and Medicaid?
Medicaid, I think, is in the same category with Medicare, but I'd be open to study that one.
Dr. Dunkelberg.
Well, Medicaid is a real threat, and I think if you look at Social Security, it might not be unreasonable to consider a change in the retirement age or looking at means testing Social Security. I think Bill Gates might be happy to give his up.
Mr. Hodge.
These programs are promising benefits that are unaffordable. And unless they're reformed, this country faces a tax increase.
So you would actually cut all three?
We have to reform all of them. And there are different ways that you can go about making them actuarially sound and fiscally sound. But otherwise, we face a tax increase that this country has never faced before. And that will be detrimental and devastating to the economic growth of this country.
Thank you. I know Senator Klobuchar is on her way, so let me just ask one more question until she gets here. And first of all, one piece of good news is obviously with the growing competitive economy, I know Social Security, as an example, is on firmer footing with more revenues coming in, with a stronger economy and dollars coming in overall for the federal government. But Mr. Hodge, what are your major areas of disagreement now with Dr. Harris's testimony? Because you're kind of, on opposite ends here. I mean, why are you right? And Dr. Dunkelberg and Mr. Hinderaker, you can add something, but maybe just outline some of the perspectives you might have, Mr. Hodge versus Dr. Harris, because you're at opposite ends on the testimony here.
I guess I am on his right today. All kidding.
But why are you right?
No, I think the major disagreement here is on the effects of deficits and crowding out in the economy. Actually, if you look at a lot of the models that the Tax Policy Center, the Wharton, CBO, Joint Committee on Taxation, if you line them up to the way that we've estimated or looked at these, the Tax Reform and Jobs Act, it's fairly similar. They show that it's pro-growth. Where we differ is on the effects of the deficit in this, quote, crowding out that happens and rising interest rates. We don't see that happening. There's $20 trillion a year worth of savings globally every year, and a little bit of deficit in the United States is not going to crowd out and raise interest rates on a global basis. So we don't believe that that is actually a proper way to look at this. And so while they see economic growth from this plan, it gets, quote, crowded out by this deficit effect. We don't think that that's a correct way to look at it. And that's why we show much more growth than they do.
Dr. Dunkelberg and Mr. Hinderaker, you can add something as Senator Klobuchar gets ready for.
Sure. I'd point out two things or three things maybe, but obviously it was noted that one of the things that's growing really quickly is the cost of benefits. And so when we go to measure wages, we should really be paying attention to that. We should also note that, that employment is growing substantially. Millions of new jobs are created. What was their income before they got the job? I mean, so yeah, we include them when we take total wages and divide it by the total number of people working, and we get an average wage. Gee, it didn't go up as much as we hoped. But how about all the people that are in there that weren't in there before? We really have to acknowledge that. And finally, we do know that government revenues do grow when the economy grows, and so we've got more people to tax and we've got higher incomes to tax. Government revenue, we've never been able to estimate that very well going forward. It's going to certainly mitigate the deficit issue.
Mr. Hinderaker, a brief comment before we.
Briefly on this issue of the missing $4,000 in wage increases, in Minnesota, in only 6 months, we have seen significant wage increases, which if you annualize it, adds up to $1,200 per year. That's a big chunk of the $4,000 in just 6 months. So I would push back on this theory that we're not seeing wage increases. We certainly are in Minnesota.
Senator Klobuchar, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Oh, I've spent a lot of time talking to a lot of hourly workers. I've yet to find one that even felt like they got $1,000 or a $1,200 raise. I think that flies in the face of real experience out with real working people.
Okay, well, I can only be here briefly because we have another hearing going on that you might have heard of. So I feel like I'm going to start asking you guys about, the Times v. Sullivan or precedent versus settled law, but I'll try to focus on our topic at hand. And I had one specific thing that I was figuring out during the debate on the tax bill. I'll start with you because I think you know about this, Dr. Harris. And this is something that I spoke with Gene Sperling about, who's the former director of the National Economic Council. And he warned before the tax law was passed that its allowance of a global minimum tax rather than a country-by-country minimum will incentivize companies to shift more of their operations overseas. And I think it's probably too soon to know if that's happened, but the idea was that if you do it country-by-country minimum, it wouldn't have that kind of incentive. But if you do this global minimum tax, there'd be some incentive because you'd want to get at the average, and so some of the jobs would move to basically no tax countries. And I just wondered if you could respond to that.
So I agree that it is too early to evaluate the impact of the changes in our foreign system of foreign taxation, but there is, I think, legitimate concern that some of the provisions in the TCJA, perhaps inadvertently, will push domestic activity overseas. So for the GILTI and for the FDII provisions, those are both based on tangible assets. And so if you're a company and you move your factory overseas with those two particular provisions, you'll get a higher tax benefit, all else equal. Before, what we saw in our tax code was that there were incentives to move intangible activity overseas. Apple, tech companies that had IP, and they were basically trading in ideas. The problem with the current system now is that there are provisions that will incent the movement of factories and actual real production. So I agree that it's too early to tell, but if you just look at the incentives, companies do have an incentive to pick up that factory out of places like Minnesota and every state in the country and move it overseas because they get a tax benefit if they do so. We'll be watching that carefully, but right now I think it's a real concern.
Does anyone else want to comment or anything? Okay. Mr. Hidge, each year Congress's Joint Committee on Taxation releases a list of tax expenditures. Those are deductions, exclusions, and Congress has long talked about broadening the base by reforming these tax expenditures, thereby reducing the complexity of the tax code, boosting fairness, reducing the deficit, and that was the overreaching goal of that drove that bipartisan tax reform way back in 1986. To what extent did the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act broaden the base by eliminating tax expenditures to offset rate reductions?
It did some, but not enough. We would recommend that Congress go much further in eliminating tax expenditures. We would trade those off for lower rates. We do think that that's the key to economic growth, is broadening the base and lowering rates. There was a little bit of work done on that, but not enough. There's still far too much junk in the tax code, far too much complexity, and it's costing the economy. The more we can rid the code of those sorts of things, the better.
Okay. Maybe I'll end here with our home state guest, Mr. Hinderaker. Welcome. And I had wanted to bring the corporate rate down. I've made that clear many times, including during the debate. But I was concerned that it just went too far where it ended up, and you and I will have reasonable disagreement on this. And one of the reasons I was concerned was that every point we went down was $100 billion. And one of the ways that we could have spent maybe 1%, one point of that money was on infrastructure. And we had a bipartisan bill that was good that passed a few years ago that Senator McConnell actually led in the Senate. I was one of the first Democrats to sign on, called the FAST Act, which is a scary name to name any bill in Congress. But it passed, and we were able to add some money into infrastructure. But I think we still are so behind when we've got the American Society of Civil Engineers 2013 report card, U.S. still D+ on overall condition of the nation's infrastructure. We obviously had issues in Minnesota with the bridge collapse. We put more state money into a number of our projects there. But what are your ideas for funding infrastructure? What do you think we should do? Because now we've gone down to this rate where it's going to be harder to get that kind of funding that I think we need, not just your traditional congestion issues or jobs from infrastructure. It's just getting goods to market in this colossally intertwined global economy, whether it's locks and dams or rail or highways and bridges.
Well, Senator, I disagree with the idea that these cuts have created a revenue problem. I think the federal government has got more than enough revenue. I think the question is, what should the government be doing with that revenue? You mentioned the corporate income tax. We didn't cut it way down. We cut it down to about average. So at least it's not totally non-competitive, but it still isn't about the average range. I agree with you that infrastructure is something that should be prioritized. And I think in the vast dollars that are being spent by the federal government, adequate infrastructure should be a high priority. So I don't know that we're disagreeing too fundamentally there.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Representative Paulsen and Senator Heinrich.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. We had a House vote that was called, which is why we lost a few members during our discussion. But I will remind members that if they wish to submit questions for the record, the hearing record will remain open for 3 business days. And with that, I will adjourn the hearing.